for those of us that knew Toni or work with Toni, I mean, she's clearly somebody that changed my life in many ways. I met Toni in 1986, and at a bookstore in Germantown called My Solitude. It's no longer there. It's a wonderful little bookstore on Germantown Avenue, and she was reading excerpts of what became Those Bones Were Not My Child, which was about Atlanta missing and murdered children. This is a book that Morrison stopped her own work, stopped Paradise, for like 18 months to finish that book after Toni died. And so she was reading excerpts from it. But she began it actually with the Goldilocks. I mean, she had all these wonderful kind of, these wonderful, taking these folk tales and really analyzing them and really making them useful and critiquing them in her wonderful, wonderful way. And at that reading, Toni was as interested in who was in the audience. Like if Toni were here, she would do something that probably we don't have time to do in this 40 minutes. She would engage everybody in this room. Everybody in this room would have some sense of who she was, and she would certainly have a sense of who everybody in the room was. And that's what she did at the book signing. And she said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I started this place called Scribe Video Center, and I teach a film class. And she said, oh, wow. And 2 weeks later, I'm having this film class. Toni's the only student that shows up. And it's like so embarrassing. And I said, I'm so embarrassed. Like, I'm going to refund. I don't think I was charging anything, but I'm so embarrassed. And she said, wait, I'm not someone. I'm here to learn. You're not going to teach. I said, oh, okay. So we did a workshop. And then afterwards we went for coffee, and that was actually around the time I was beginning what was then the bombing of Osage Avenue, and we began talking about that, and asked her if she wanted to really help save me with this film, which I really did not want to make. And anyway, so we ended up working together for about 10 years, from '86 until she died in 1995. She taught workshops at Scribe, and was a really, really, really key person in the Philadelphia cultural community. Very, very important in terms of connecting people in, cultural communities here, elsewhere. I'm quite sure, relationships with like Black British filmmakers. Those were things that Toni kind of made happen. Folks like John Acumpha and June Giovanni and Isaac Julian, I kind of see as being kind of Toni connections. A lot of that footage actually was from this wonderful women's conference in London that happened in, I guess, '85. The June Giovanni, who some folks may know, produced. So she had a huge impact, and also was a guide for many folks. So anyway, that's.
So I appreciate that, especially this that you were able to give her a one-on-one tutorial.
Well, no, and then she wanted her 4-week workshop, so she got the 4-week workshop. Yeah,
to me, that's the perfect scenario as a student, right? So 2 things I think about when I think about the work of Toni Cade Bambara that I'd love your response to. The first is, to me, she's the quintessential example of not even just the ability to, but the necessity for being both critical and serious and political, but also funny and humane, and that those 2 things are mutually exclusive. There's a version of how we've been talking about this recently in the School of Social Policy and Practice that actually came out of a discussion that was offered up by an Annenberg faculty member a few weeks ago, which is this distinction between calling people out and calling them in. And so part of what I think about when I think about what Toni Cade Bambara has written, especially the writing, the ways in which she embodied a certain kind of political ethos, she was equally good not just as calling people out for when they do things that are wrong, that are unethical, but also calling them into community, right? And you can see this. You can see this in how people talk about her. You can see this in the ways in which she inhabits a space. This ability not simply to think about criticality as always a sharp sword that cuts people down, but also something that constructs a notion of commonality. So one, does that sound like
Absolutely. I mean, I think of in Philadelphia the way that Toni was able to bring people together and find commonality and find allies. One particular example actually was thinking about the Black British film community. There was a very important gathering in Boston called Celebrating Black Cinema, and at that point the Black Brit community was very, very segmented, and I think they have been intentionally segmented and separated by the way the funding was and the way it was structurally arranged, that these black co-ops, cooperatives began. And Toni did like miracle work and really was able to bring together people that thought that they were ideologically opposed, but really was able to say, you know, there is a commonality of struggle and there's a commonality of purpose, and we are community. So very intentional part of her work. She was an organizer, absolutely an organizer, and really understood that that is the goal. You know, leaving the room with some, gathering up of energy, and that gathering up of energy leading to something, very specific, some sort of change. So yeah, you're hitting it.
That's helpful. I do think that a version of being a good filmmaker, maybe especially independent filmmaker, but probably across the board, is being incredibly adept at organizing what can otherwise be a chaotic collectivity with one focus, one drive, and one goal. So it seems like there's a version of that sensibility,
right? But also continually questioning unnecessary hierarchy. So if I think film production has developed a kind of hierarchy, and some of that hierarchy has a very specific purpose. But if there's a hierarchy there that doesn't really have that goes against the politics of the work, to really question that and say, no, we don't have to work that way. We can work, in a way that, we can have, let's say, the narrator. Let's really think about what it means to have a narrator, and what is the narrator's role to content. What is the camera person's relationship to content? So, and how, and because somebody is directing the camera, it doesn't necessarily mean that the ideas of the researcher are not as important. So anyway,
it's
organizing, but the critique is always there.
I appreciate that.
Structural critique.
So one of the things that to me was incredibly moving about the film is I feel like every single person you interviewed had something so poignant and memorable to say about not just the way they interfaced with her, but about the value of what she contributed. But one thing that I really want you to at least in some way give me some feedback on is what Haile Gerima says. Because he makes the point, I won't take out my notes, but something to the effect of, she was the first person that he at least had identified who could decode what he framed as almost kind of black cinematic language. And for me, that begs the question of then what does that mean for the ways in which she approached filmmaking? Like, how would you characterize her specifically as a filmmaker? Like what describes or distinguishes her approach to film form, language, and the kinds of ways in which I think we can make sense of Haile Gerima's claim there? Do you have anything for us on that front?
Yeah, I think I'm going to. It's a big question. I'm going to focus for a second on documentary and archive. I think that Toni, our relationship with archive has changed because now all of us have, I'm betting, all of us have a camera in our pocket. in 2018, which was not the case 30 years ago, where the archive, for the most part, the film archive was something that was controlled, and very, very, very few people had access to the archive, and even worse, the archive was from a very, very particular perspective. So I think that Toni was continually critiquing the Mulvey term, the gaze, and continually, but also using that gaze as a way, interacting with that gaze, not just talking about it, but how do we incorporate that particular perspective of if one is using archive as a way of providing evidence in a film, how does one use that in a way that, even though it wasn't your gaze, that you sort of you can incorporate that in terms of your position, your perspective, your storytelling, and this goes back to the hierarchy thing, which has something to do with what Hailey says. The hierarchies, come out of this, corporate, white male thing, that cinema as it's developed, and really understanding that and not replicating that, not replicating narrative devices that are by their very nature going to be destructive. Using death. I mean, you see this in her novels too. She's very, very, very careful about how one uses death as a plot device. I mean, when you think of when you think of drama and narrative traditions, I mean, death is this essential way of sort of pushing a story forward. I mean, we will turn on our TV sets for news or for drama. Death really guides us, but she really looked at, well, what does that mean when our narrative is sort of being always pushed forward by death, and when is it right to use death? So there were definitely a lot of analysis of the way things are and how we can kind of reclaim them and sort of create new ways of talking to each other.
Deb mentioned earlier that for the last 8 years or so, we've been working, especially with the PhD students, on ways of using things other than articles or book chapters or full-length written manuscripts to tell stories that we think aren't simply for public audiences, so it's not just the version of public intellectualism, but specifically attempts to make interventions into the scholarly community, right? And to redefine what counts as scholarship. But part of what we know we're trying to also understand, and we're not doctrinaire about it, so it's not one size fits all. And when you look at the projects I think the students have produced, there isn't a kind of Penn approach to doing this work. But we do constantly, I think, or at least I do, I won't speak for everyone else, struggle with the idea of what we gain with that move, right? What can you do in images and sound, say, that you can't do on a blank page? And it reminds me of something Toni Morrison said kind of jokingly, which was, Toni Cade Bambara was a writer. Right? Why was she doing film? Right? I mean, what a travesty to imagine she was going to. And I guess part of what I want then to ask you, if you have any insight on it, what she thought she could get out of making movies that was different from what she was doing as a writer beforehand, if anything, right? Was this just an extension, a continuation? Was it a radical transformation? How she told the story about the political present? Like, why did she gravitate to film? What did she think it could give her or do that maybe wasn't quite the same as what she did as
well, I mean, you look at Ousmane Sembène, I mean, so certainly a number of people who start off as writers understand that cinema and the language of the image is a much more popular way, is a way of reaching many more people and conversing with a community that you want to converse with. So there are possibilities. There are people that don't read. There are people that don't read novels that definitely see films, and so I think it was just realizing that this was another tool. But also, there was a genuine love of the language of cinema. I mean, I think what Walter, her brother, says, Toni she loved movies. I mean, I didn't have I'm really slow with technology. I'm slow with acquiring new technologies. Like, I really don't like to spend money. And I didn't have a VHS cassette player. And it just drove Toni nuts. I mean, because I had one at Scrubs. She's like, Lou, what are you doing at home? I mean, but she just devoured. I mean, we'd go to movies, a lot. And she devoured movies and really enjoyed, the sort of, there are narrative possibilities with cinema that are just not, that are only cinema. So yeah, I think that's, but again, she continued to write. It's not like she stopped writing, but she continued to write.
Do you get a sense that, or did she ever talk about the extent to which the filmmaking changed her approach to writing, or impacted the way she thought about herself in a kind of writerly sense, or not necessarily?
We didn't talk so much about that. I mean, certainly her writing is very, very visual and lends itself well, I think, is cinematic in some ways. Is the foundation of cinema. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't believe she wrote novels with the thought that, oh, I'm writing this novel so that it can be back into cinema. But I think there is a visualness, a sense of place, a sense of four-dimensional space in her novels that is cinematic.
I appreciate that. So it's a little bit of time. I'm going to ask you what might be my final question before we open it up. It'll be two-pronged, like a kind of connector. So the first is, you mentioned that you want to have multiple formats for the film.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about what those are and what the audiences are for those different formats and why? And then what do you imagine is the biggest takeaway for this group about this story? Why is this an important thing for us to hear and appreciate in 2018 going into 19? What does it teach us that maybe we've heard or seen before, but might shed newfangled light on to prepare us for the current moment?
Yeah, well, I'm going to start with the second first. So, I'm a decade or two older than you. So I definitely feel that the 60s had an enormous impact on why I'm sitting here. And I feel that that in institutions, I realize that this has come definitely as a result of struggle, and that there's also a joyous responsibility. I want to keep using that joyous. There's a joyous responsibility that the institutions, the city, the community is not right. We've got to make it so that we can be full human beings. All of us can be full human beings, and that is our goal. More than the paycheck, more than and so I think that what one understands from Toni as a cultural worker, that is, how does one use culture, and remembering how does one use culture in a transformative way? How does one, to the best of one's ability, apply culture in a way that can support movement, support change? How does one, so in whatever we do, how at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of our lives, how have we kind of taken us all further, taken us to a better place so that we can maintain and improve on our humanity? So I think that is, that to me is why Toni Cade is extraordinarily relevant. In terms of the format, this again, I was saying earlier, I don't like. I'm nervous about showing like excerpts because I know in some ways I was doing this as a kind of a proof of concept, and also I did it for Spellman. Spellman is where Toni's archives is, and each year they have a Toni Cade Bambara Scholar Activist Conference. So, you know, Beverly Guy Sheftel, who runs the Women's Resource and Center in the Women's Studies program in the Women's Resource Center, has been a wonderful supporter of the film. And so I kind of made it kind of for one of the conferences that Beverly has. But I know, I think formally that the film will be much more chaptered, and as opposed to like a narrative, you know, a single narrative. And I think those chapters, even if the film is seen in a kind of linear way rather than as discrete kind of segments, I think that I want the lessons learned, and there are different kinds of lessons, because I mean, Morrison wasn't buying my thesis. Like, that is, well, my thesis is what lessons did you learn from Toni's life? And so, like, Morrison is not that. Although Morrison did say that Toni is one of the few people that she really considered a peer, which is a huge thing. But the other side is it wasn't like, you know, Morrison's older than Toni. It wasn't like Toni was Morrison's teacher. It wasn't like Toni Cade was Toni Morrison's teacher. But she learned things from her life, you know. So anyway, so I'm trying to make the film will be constructed with much clearer chapters, and that's, you know, part of what we're working on now. We just finished some wonderful shooting in Atlanta in October, and thank goodness for spring break or fall break here, and we still haven't shot in Philadelphia. So I mean, there are definitely people like Aisha Simmons here in Philly, and Sonia Sanchez, and some other folks that we want to talk to. But it will not be quite as a witness film. There's lots more archival. There's a kind of a treasure trove of archival material that we haven't yet really applied yet.
And where are the archives? That's where you're getting the material.
Scrap Video Center.
You all did a good job.